Now to those rising tensions on the streets of Hong Kong. Police and protesters going into an 11th week of clashes as gathering Chinese forces loom across the border.
Tensions mounting in Hong Kong.
Protesters surrounded a police station earlier, and now you can see the riot police have come out in force.
Traffic cones, suitcases, and laser pointers. These are just some of the objects that have been made into tactical gear by demonstrators in Hong Kong.
We won't go home. We won't until we are victory at last.
This was Hong Kong 4 years ago. Millions of people took to the street to protest against the CCP and to fight for Hong Kong's freedom. The numbers of protesters kept growing by the day. The movement reached every corner of the world, and it seemed like, for the first time in almost forever, that the will of the people may actually win. But after a while, most of the world just kind of forgot. But the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping didn't forget. In June of 2022, Hong Kong held a big parade for the 25th anniversary of the handover. But this wasn't just a party. It was a clear message. Speaking to a hand-picked crowd, Xi Jinping said, "And after the wind and rain, Hong Kong has risen from the ashes." What he really meant was that Hong Kong was no longer the free city it once was. Beijing's control was now stronger than ever. But this moment didn't just happen overnight. It was the result of years of careful moves by Beijing to slowly take away Hong Kong's freedoms, one piece at a time. The changes had already started earlier. In 2021, Beijing completely changed Hong Kong's voting system. Now, only people who were loyal to the CCP could run for office. This made many politicians powerless to fight back. Then, in 2024, a new version of the national security law gave the government even more power to silence anyone who disagreed. Activists were thrown in jail. Independent news outlets like Apple Daily and Stand News were shut down. Unions and community groups were forced to close. Step by step, Beijing made it harder for anyone to speak out. Thousands of students, professionals, and activists decided to leave Hong Kong. Those who stayed found it almost impossible to resist. But we will not stop fighting for Hong Kongers' freedom and independence. The CCP is usually not happy about small news channels exposing their lies, but with your support, we will continue to fight CCP's $30 billion a year propaganda budget. You can support us in this fight by hitting the like button and the subscribe button down below. It really does help us expose the truth about the CCP to more people. We thank you. By early 2025, the effects of Beijing's control of Hong Kong could be seen everywhere. The crackdown wasn't just about stopping protests. It was about completely taking over Hong Kong. The new National Security Office played a leading role, showing that Hong Kong's leaders now answered directly to Beijing. Civil servants had to take loyalty oaths. Even the last bit of local democracy, the district council elections, were canceled. Beijing had fully broken the promise of one country, two systems. What was left was just an empty slogan. The freedoms that once made Hong Kong special were almost completely gone. Beijing made its position very clear. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Zhaokun said, "Hong Kong is China's Hong Kong and brooks no outside interference." At the same time, China placed sanctions on U.S. lawmakers and human rights groups, trying to push back against U.S. efforts to hold Hong Kong officials responsible for crushing freedoms. Meanwhile, China's state-run media was working hard to change the story. They painted the United States not as a defender of democracy, but as a fading superpower, trying to hang on to its influence. All of this happened while the U.S. and China were fighting a tough trade war. U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods reached 145%, and China hit back with 125% tariffs of its own. This made global markets nervous. But for Hong Kong, the bigger problem was political. With its democracy destroyed and its reputation as a global financial hub slipping away, Hong Kong was losing the identity it had built over many decades. Once a proud symbol of freedom and success, Hong Kong had now become a clear example of the CCP's growing hunger for expansion. So today, let's go over how the CCP took over Hong Kong while the whole world was distracted. To really understand why Hong Kong had its own government separate from China for so long, you have to go back to the 1800s, a time when powerful countries from Europe were taking parts of Asia for themselves. It all started when Britain forced China to hand over some coastal areas after the Opium Wars. And let's be clear, China didn't agree willingly. Britain used its strong military to force China to sign unfair deals. The main reason for the conflict was Britain's opium trade. Britain was making a lot of money selling opium, a highly addictive drug to China. But the Chinese emperor saw that millions of his people were getting addicted, and country badly. People in China were hooked on opium. It wasn't just a health problem, it was destroying the economy as well. The emperor tried to stop the opium trade, but Britain didn't want to lose its profits. This led to two wars, the First and the Second Opium Wars, with France joining Britain in the Second War. Because Britain and France had stronger armies, they forced China to agree to humiliating peace terms. One major result? After the First Opium Wars ended in 1842, Britain took control of Hong Kong Island. Later, after the Second Opium War, they grabbed even more land, including a 99-year lease on the new territory starting in 1898. Before this all happened, Hong Kong was just a small fishing village, barely noticed by anyone. But under British rule, it changed a lot. The population grew from just a few thousand to millions. Hong Kong became a major international trading hub, partly because it was a free port with close ties to the British Empire. In the early years, opium was still a big part of Hong Kong's economy, but over time, trade expanded to include things like tea and silk. The city's importance in the world grew quickly, but it wasn't always easy. During World War II, Hong Kong was captured by Japan. Life under Japanese occupation was extremely harsh. After the war ended, the British returned and Hong Kong bounced back faster than anyone expected. Meanwhile, things in mainland China were very different. China was struggling under communist rule, while Hong Kong's free market economy was booming. By the 1950s, Hong Kong was a major center for textiles and later for electronics. Along with South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, Hong Kong became known as one of the 4 Asian tigers for its fast-growing economy. British rule left a big mark on Hong Kong. English stayed an important language, and Western culture shaped many things, like the legal system and pop culture. But life under colonial rule wasn't perfect. There were protests and riots in 1956, 1966, 1967, and 1981. Many people believed colonialism was unfair and outdated. Pressure for change kept growing. By the time the 99-year lease was about to end in 1997, it was clear that Britain had to give Hong Kong back to China. But handing it over wasn't simple. Hong Kong had developed a completely different political and economic system from the mainland. People were worried about what would happen under communist rule. So, to calm those fears, Britain and China made a special agreement called One Country, Two Systems. Under this deal, Hong Kong would be a part of China, but it would keep its capitalist economy, political freedoms, and way of life for 50 years, until 2047. These promises were written into the Basic Law, Hong Kong's mini constitution. The city got its own legislator, its own courts, and its own executive branch. It even kept its own money and financial system. Most importantly, there was the promise that over time, Hong Kong would get free and fair elections. Under this deal, Hong Kong would be a part of China, but it would keep its capitalist economy, political freedoms, and way of life for 50 years, until 2047. These promises were written into the Basic Law, Hong Kong's mini constitution. The city got its own legislator, its own courts, and its own executive branch. It even kept its own money and financial system. Most importantly, there was the promise that over time, Hong Kong would get free and fair elections. But there was a catch. These democratic changes were supposed to happen gradually, which gave China lots of chances to slow things down and take more control. And that's exactly what happened. Systems like the election committee, which decided who could run for leadership, made sure true democracy stayed out of reach. Over the years, Beijing slowly took away more and more of Hong Kong's freedoms and independence. Before we go into how the CCP is enforcing its control over Hong Kong, we first need to understand why it gave the city its freedom in the first place. After all, Beijing had the right to just take over the territory in one go back in 1997. But the independence of Hong Kong actually has benefits for the mainland. The city is the international gateway for China for foreign investment and finance. Because if we look at the statistics, in 2023, more than 70% of China's utilized foreign direct investment came from Hong Kong, reaching $137 billion in a single year. This has gained steam over the last 2 decades. Now, these billions aren't coming from Hong Kong itself. With a GDP of just $360 billion, it can't possibly send $137 billion a year worth of investments to China. Most of the money actually comes from financial institutions based in other countries, who use Hong Kong as a conduit for China. This has to do with Hong Kong's unique financial system. Although Singapore overtook it in 2022, Hong Kong used to be Asia's financial hub and the 3rd biggest financial center in the world. The reason it was so popular is that the city has its own financial regulations and currency, which makes it more attractive for foreign investors. Both institutions and retail investors prefer not to put their money directly into China, because of the risks that are associated with it. It's not really a free market economy, so there's always the chance that the CCP intervenes. Also, the Chinese government doesn't really welcome foreign investors on the mainland. In order to invest directly, you need licenses, such as the Qualified Foreign Institutional Investor. And even if you obtain such a license, after a long bureaucratic process, you are still subjected to strict CCP guidelines. Because this is such a hassle, much of the investment goes through the Hong Kong Stock Connect and Bond Connect markets. These are financial schemes for Hong Kong investors that make it easy to access the Shenzhen and Shanghai stock exchanges and China's debt markets. But what makes Hong Kong even more appealing as a financial gateway is the currency situation. In order to buy Chinese yuan-denominated assets with US dollars, going through Hong Kong is by far the easiest way. The Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, which makes transactions very stable. Meanwhile, the Chinese yuan and the US dollar aren't fully convertible due to capital restrictions. However, it's possible to transfer your US dollars into Hong Kong dollars and then convert them into Chinese yuan in Hong Kong. The setup is all on purpose, of course. For the Chinese government, it's a way to get foreign cash without being directly exposed to international currency markets. This shields it from a lot of financial instability and potential crisis. And that role is only amplified by Hong Kong's place at the heart of the Greater Bay Area. The GBA, in short, only helps with its function as an international bank for China. The area houses around 86 million people, with a combined GDP of around 1.9 trillion US dollars. This includes the third and fifth biggest cities in China by GDP, namely Guangzhou and Shenzhen. There are a lot of booming enterprises nearby, and all of them need investment and loans to keep growing. This financial incentive was one of the main reasons why the CCP didn't completely take over the city in 1997. As a strategic conduit, Hong Kong has been one of the key drivers of China's economic rise over the last decades. However, Hong Kong's political freedoms didn't fit into China's interests. Perhaps it was too dangerous for the CCP to have a beacon of free speech and democracy right next door, as the citizens on the mainland could get dangerous ideas. The tension between Hong Kong's hopes for democracy and Beijing's desire to control really started showing in 1991. That year, Hong Kong held its first ever legislative elections as a kind of practice run before the 1997 handover to China. Two main sides quickly formed: the pro-democracy camp, led by Martin Lee's United Democrats, and the pro-Beijing camp, which wanted Hong Kong to have closer ties to mainland China. When the votes were counted, it was a huge win for the United Democrats. For a short, exciting moment, it looked like Hong Kong might actually have a real democratic future. But that hope didn't last long. Over time, problems started to appear. The political system was slowly changing to help people who supported Beijing. They redrew voting districts to give pro-Beijing candidates an advantage. They also created special voting groups called functional constituencies, and quietly put loyalists into important government jobs. Little by little, the dream of true democracy for regular people was kind of being chipped away. To really understand how Hong Kong's democracy was taken apart, you have to take a look at the system put in place after 1997. At the center of all of it was the chief executive, the city's top leader. You might think of the chief executive like a president, but with a big difference. The chief executive isn't chosen by the people. Instead, they're picked by a group called the Election Committee. Most members of this committee aren't elected by regular voters. They come from business groups, professional associations, and political organizations, most of which are very close to Beijing. The Legislative Council, or LegCo, had similar problems. It was supposed to pass laws, approve budgets, and keep the government in check. But the way members were chosen made that hard. Out of 60 seats, only 20 were chosen by the people. Another 30 were picked by the functional constituencies, special interest groups, and the last 10 were chosen by the election committee. This setup gave a lot of power to the elites, not to everyday citizens. And this wasn't by accident. The system was designed on purpose to let Beijing control Hong Kong politics from behind the scenes. Many of the business and professional groups had strong reasons to stay friendly with Beijing. After all, China is Hong Kong's biggest trading partner, and trade and services flowing through Hong Kong are worth about 4 times the city's entire economy. If you ran a big company, keeping Beijing happy was basically necessary to survive. It's a lot easier to control a few hundred insiders than millions of regular voters. That's where the Hong Kong Liaison's office comes in. Hidden away in a cold, glassy building, this office acts as China's main base in Hong Kong. Its job is to build relationships with pro-Beijing politicians, plan elections, make sure the right people get into office. They also fund political campaigns, run several big newspapers, and own Hong Kong's largest book publisher. Behind closed doors, there are a lot of stories about secret deals, special favors, and sometimes even bribes to keep powerful people loyal to Beijing. The problems with the system became super clear during the 1998 legislative elections, the first after Hong Kong returned to China. Even though the pro-democracy side won about 2/3 of the public vote, they only got about 1/3 of the seats in Legco. For many Hong Kongers, this felt like a total betrayal. It showed that the system was clearly stacked against them. And as the years went on, people's anger kept growing. They remembered the promises made in the Basic Law, that one day Hong Kong would have a real democracy. But it became more and more obvious that Beijing wasn't planning to let that happen. The growing gap between the promises and reality made tensions rise. And eventually, all that frustration exploded, leading to the huge protests and fierce fights over Hong Kong's future that the world would see in the years to come. And as the years went on, people's anger kept growing. They remembered the promises made in the Basic Law, that one day Hong Kong would have a real democracy. But it became more and more obvious that Beijing wasn't planning to let that happen. The growing gap between the promises and reality made tensions rise. And eventually, all that frustration exploded, leading to the huge protests and fierce fights over Hong Kong's future that the world would see in the years to come. There had already been annual protests every July 1st, marking the anniversary of Hong Kong's handover to China. But in 2003, things went to a whole new level. That year, 500,000 people showed up for the march. They were angry about the new security law that would make things like treason and trying to break away from China illegal. With so many people protesting, the government had to put the law on hold for now.